I'm Adriana Quinn, 43, and I grew up on a flight line, the daughter of a marine mechanic who taught me that nobody is bigger than the airplane. For 30 years, I climbed, earning my wings, my command, every inch of it, while people kept deciding I was the spouse, the clerk, the lost woman in the wrong place. But the day before I took command of a fighter squadron, a young sergeant blocked my path, looked at my sundress, and told me to go find my husband. What I chose to do about it changed everything. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who never bothered to find out who you actually were? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand quietly in the truth while someone underestimated you, hit that like button and subscribe. The night before I took command of a Marine fighter squadron, I slept in a motel 6 miles off the base because I did not want anyone to see me arrive. People assume a change of command is the proudest day of an officer's life. Maybe for some it is. For me, it has always felt more like standing at the edge of a high board. You have done the work, you have earned the climb, and still, for one long second, there is nothing under you but the decision to step off. I had laid my flight suit across the foot of the bed and pressed the collar flat with my hand. The silver oak leaves of a lieutenant colonel caught the lamplight. I had worn that rank for almost 5 years, and I still sometimes looked at it the way you look at a word you have written so many times it stops looking spelled right. To understand why a grown woman drives to a motel to be alone the night before the best day of her career, you have to go back to a hangar in the summer of 1996, and to a man with grease worked so far into his knuckles that no soap on earth was ever going to win. My father was Gunnery Sergeant Raymond Quinn. He fixed airplanes for the Marine Corps for 22 years. He did not fly them. He kept them flying, which he always insisted was the harder and more honest half of the deal. He had a way of standing under a jet with his hands on his hips, looking up at it like a farmer looks at weather, that taught me more about respect than any school I ever attended. I was 13 the first time he walked me onto a flight line. It was a Saturday, and he was not technically supposed to bring me, and he did it anyway because my mother had a double shift and because I think he wanted to. The hangar doors were open to a white sky, and the smell hit me before anything else. Hot metal and jet fuel and rubber and the particular sweetness of hydraulic fluid. I have chased that smell my whole life. I found it again in that motel parking lot the night before I took command, drifting over the fence line on the wind, and it undid me a little, the way it always does. He let me climb the ladder of a parked Hornet and sit in the cockpit. My legs did not reach the rudder pedals. I put my hands on the canopy rail and looked out over the nose, and somewhere in that minute, a decision got made in me that I never really revisited. I was going to fly, not be near it, not marry it, fly it. My father did not laugh, and he did not gush. He stood on the hangar floor with his arms crossed and watched me, and when I climbed down, he said one thing. He said, "Nobody's bigger than the airplane, Addie. Not the pilot, not the wing commander, not me. You remember that, and you'll be all right anywhere you go." I have repeated that sentence to myself in cockpits over 3 oceans. I have repeated it on nights when I was very sure I was the most important person in a given room, and on nights when other people were very sure I was not. Because the other thing I learned on that flight line, I learned the same summer. There was a senior officer who came through the hangar one afternoon while my father was working, a colonel, and he saw me sitting on a toolbox reading, and he asked whose kid I was. My father told him, proud as anything, that I wanted to be a pilot. The colonel smiled the way men smile when they think they are being kind. He said flying wasn't really for girls, that it was a hard life, that I'd grow out of it. My father said nothing to him. He was a gunnery sergeant, and the man was a colonel, and the flight line is not a place for that argument. But on the drive home, with the windows down and the radio low, he told me the only opinion of my flying that would ever matter was the one I earned at 500 knots with my own 2 hands, when no one was around to grade me but the airplane. He said the airplane does not care if you are a boy or a girl, it only cares if you are good. And then he said the thing I have carried longest. He said, "Most people will tell you where you belong. Almost none of them have earned the right. Learn the difference early, and don't waste your life arguing with the ones who didn't earn it." I did not understand, at 13, how much of my life would turn out to be exactly that. Standing in the right uniform, in the right place, having earned every inch of it, while someone who had not earned the right decided I was in the wrong hangar. The night before I took command, I sat on the edge of that motel bed and looked at my flight suit and thought about him. He had been gone 7 years by then. He never saw me make lieutenant colonel. He never saw the day they would call me commanding officer. And I realized sitting there that I was not nervous about leading 200 Marines into a deployment. I had done harder things. I was nervous about something smaller and older than that. I was nervous about walking back onto a flight line, the kind of place that raised me, and finding out whether it still felt like home, or whether it had quietly decided, the way places do, that I was a visitor. So I did what I always do before I take on anything that matters. I made a plan to go walk the line first, alone, in my own clothes, to stand under the airplanes the way my father used to, with my hands on my hips, and remember whose daughter I am before I became anyone's commanding officer. I told myself it would be a quiet, private thing. It did not stay quiet, and it did not stay private. But I want you to understand who I was when I parked my car the next afternoon and walked toward Hangar 2 in a sundress with my sunglasses pushed up into my hair. I was not a rank. I was a 13-year-old girl who had grown up and kept her promise, going to say thank you to the place that made her. That matters for what happened next. It matters for what I chose to do about it. So hold on to it. The morning I am about to tell you about did not start with the hangar. It started, the way the best and worst days of my life always have, with the smell of jet fuel on the wind and my father's voice in my head, telling me that nobody is bigger than the airplane. Not the pilot, not the new commanding officer, and, as a young sergeant was about to find out, not the man standing at the edge of the flight line, deciding who gets to walk on. I had spent 31 years getting ready for that flight line without knowing it. I had no idea that the hardest test of everything my father taught me was going to come from a kid doing my father's exact job, and that I was going to pass it, not by what I said, but by what I refused to say. Let me take you there. It was a Sunday in the first week of May, in the year 2026, and the sky over the air station was the flat, bright white of early summer in the low country. I was about to meet Sergeant Tyler Brandt. He was about to meet a lost civilian. Only one of us was right about who the other person was. I have thought about that afternoon more times than I will admit. Not because of what he said, because of what I almost said back and didn't. The space between those two things is the whole reason I am telling you this story at all. Before I take you onto the line, I have to tell you how I got there. From a girl in a cockpit that summer to a woman pressing oak leaves flat on a motel bed. Because the climb between those 2 points is the reason the words, wrong hangar, honey, landed the way they did. They did not land on a colonel. They landed on every woman I had been on the way up. I earned my commission in the spring of 2005 at 22 years old, the first in my family to wear an officer's uniform. My father came to the ceremony in a suit that no longer fit him quite right, and he stood very straight and he did not cry, which from him was the same as weeping. He shook my hand instead of hugging me the way he would have shaken the hand of any new officer, and only later, in the parking lot, did he put one grease-stained hand on the back of my neck the way he had when I was small, and hold it there for a second and let go. That was part 1 of a long apprenticeship in being underestimated. I want to walk you through the rest because you cannot understand a quiet decision unless you understand the loud years that made it necessary. Flight school was 2 years of being told, mostly without words, that I was a problem to be solved rather than a pilot to be trained. I learned to let the work answer. I earned my wings of gold in 2007 at 24. I cried exactly once that day in a stairwell where no one could see. And then I wiped my face and went and found my father, who had driven 11 hours to be there, and who looked at the wings on my chest for a long time before he said, "Now you keep them honest." The pattern I am about to describe started almost immediately, and it never fully stopped. I would walk into a squadron, into a briefing, into an operations building, in a flight suit with wings on my chest, and someone would decide I was something else. A visiting reporter, a spouse who had wandered in, an admin clerk. Once, memorably, a young Marine handed me his dry cleaning. I learned not to make a scene. I learned to set my helmet bag down on the table where the aircrew sat, slowly, and let the room rearrange itself around the new information. The wings did the arguing, so I did not have to. By 2009, I was a captain, flying Hornets off ships and out of airfields, whose names I am not going to spell out here. In 2011, I flew close air support over Helmand Province in Afghanistan, during a stretch I do not talk about much. A patrol got pinned in a riverbed by fire from 3 sides, and the weather was ugly, and I came down lower than the book likes and put my ordnance where it needed to be. Twice, close enough that the ground commander later said he felt the heat of it. Everyone on that patrol went home. They gave me the Distinguished Flying Cross for that day. I keep the medal in a drawer. I keep the names of the men who walked off that riverbed somewhere I can reach faster. I tell you that not to impress you. I tell you because I want you to hold it next to the words, "Go find your husband," and feel the size of the gap, the way I felt it. In 2013, I went through the Weapons and Tactics Instructor course, which is about the hardest thing the Marine air community asks of a pilot, and I came out the other side a WTIs, the people the squadron send their hardest problems to. I made major in 2015. I transitioned to the F-35 Bravo, the jump jet, in 2017, and learned to land an airplane, like setting a cup on a shelf. I made lieutenant colonel in 2021. And somewhere in all of that, I started a private ritual. Before I took on anything that frightened me, any new squadron, any new job that mattered, I would go and walk a flight line alone, in civilian clothes with no rank on me at all. I would stand under the airplanes and remember my father and the hangar in 1996. My friend Danny Okafor, who flew with me for years and is now my operations officer, used to tease me about it. She said, "You and your hangar walks. One day somebody's going to think you're casing the place." She was almost right. One day somebody thought I was lost. My father died in 2019 when I was 36. I was a major, deployed, when the call came. I did not get home in time. I have made my peace with most of my life, but not entirely with that. He kept airplanes flying for 22 years, and he raised a daughter who flew them, and he went out without seeing the best of it. And the last clean thing I have of him is a sentence about nobody being bigger than the airplane. So when I parked my car that Sunday in May and walked toward Hangar 2 with the jet fuel on the wind, I was not going to walk a flight line. I was going to visit my father. I just did not have a grave handy, so I used the next best thing, which was the only church I have ever really believed in. A hangar with the doors open to a white sky. I want you to picture me clearly, because the man I am about to introduce did not. A woman in her early 40s, in a pale sundress, sunglasses up in her dark hair, no bag, no rank, no entourage, walking slow, looking up at the airplanes the way a farmer looks at weather, smiling a little, the way you smile at a place that knew you before you were anybody. That is who Sergeant Tyler Brandt saw. He saw a sundress. He did not see 30 years of climbing. He did not see Helmand. He did not see the oak leaves I would be wearing in 18 hours. He saw a woman where he had decided women like that did not belong, and he made the oldest mistake on the flight line. He decided he knew where I belonged. The far apron still had the remains of a family day on it, folding tables and a bouncy castle being deflated and the smell of charcoal going cold. I had timed my walk for the tail end of it, figuring the line would be quiet and a stray civilian would not draw a second look. I signed in at the gate as a guest under my own name, and the young Marine at the gate did not connect Adriana Quinn, the visitor, with the name that would be read aloud at a change of command the next morning. And why would he? I was just a woman in a car with a base sticker, here for the cookout, probably. I walked past the tables and toward Hangar 2, and that is where Sergeant Brandt stepped in front of me. He was 25 years old, I would learn later, a plane captain, one of the Marines who launches and recovers the jets and signs his name to the fact that they are safe to fly. Good at his job, I would also learn later. He had the easy confidence of a young man who is genuinely competent at something hard and has not yet learned that competence at one thing does not make you right about everything. He had a clipboard under one arm and a cocky tilt to his head, and 3 or 4 junior Marines behind him near the hangar door, watching. "Ma'am," he said, and the word was not respect, it was the stop sign. "Help you with something?" "Just looking," I said. I used to spend time around airplanes. Thought I'd come say hello to them. I should have known from his face that it was not going to go well. He smiled, and it was the Colonel's smile from 1996, the smile men smile when they think they're being kind by putting you back where you go. "Yeah, this is the flight line," he said, slow, like he was explaining it to a child. "Family day's the other way." He jerked his chin back toward the dying cookout. "Wrong hangar, honey, go find your husband. He's probably wondering where you wandered off to." A couple of the Marines behind him laughed, not cruel exactly, just young and following the loudest kid in the room. I want to tell you exactly what happened in me in that second, because it is the hinge of this entire story. First came the heat. The 13-year-old's heat, the one from the colonel in the hangar, the one I have felt 1,000 times since. The pure animal flush of being told, by someone who had not earned the right, that I was in the wrong place. I felt my jaw set. I felt the two words load themselves in the chamber, the words that would have ended his afternoon and started a very bad week for him. My rank, my job, the thing I would be by morning. One sentence and the smile would have fallen off his face like a dropped wrench. And then I looked at his coveralls. I looked at the tools on his belt and the grease on his knuckles. Grease worked in past where soap reaches, and I heard my father, plain as the wind, saying, "Nobody is bigger than the airplane," and I understood something that cooled the heat right out of me. This kid did my father's job. This cocky, wrong young man with the clipboard and the easy laugh turned the same wrenches my father turned for 22 years. And he had just looked at a woman who grew up on a flight line and decided, on sight, that she did not belong on it. I had two words that would have flattened him. I have spent 30 years learning when not to use them. "My mistake, Sergeant," I said. I even smiled, and I meant most of it. "I'll get out of your way." And I turned around and walked back toward the cars, unhurried, while a 25-year-old Marine laughed behind me, not knowing what tomorrow was. Behind him, though, one man did not laugh. Staff Sergeant Lou Pratt, Brant's shop chief, had come to the hangar door at the tail of it and caught enough to frown. He did not know who I was either, but he had been in long enough to know that you do not actually know who anyone is, and that the flight line punishes that kind of certainty eventually. He filed it away. He told me much later that he almost called after me and didn't, and that not calling after me is one of the small regrets he carries. I drove back to the motel. I did not feel triumphant, I want to be honest with you, because this is the part people get wrong about restraint. Walking away did not feel like winning. It felt like swallowing something with edges. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time with the lamp on and the flight suit hanging on the door. And I did the thing I have learned to do, which is to take a stinging moment apart to see what is actually in it. What stung was not that a young man was rude to a stranger. Rude men are weather. You do not take weather personally. What stung was that he did my father's job and he still could not see me. My whole life, the people who could not see me were outsiders. Officers' wives at parties, reporters, men in suits, people who did not know the flight line. But this was a Marine, a plane captain, a member of the exact tribe my father belonged to, the tribe that raised me, and he had looked right at me and seen a lost wife. It made me wonder if the place that made me had changed into a place that would not recognize its own daughter. And that is a lonelier feeling than any insult. So I called the one person who always tells me the truth. Colonel Hank Brennan, retired now, who was my first squadron commander 20 years ago, who saw a junior officer everyone else was busy underestimating and decided to spend his time on her instead. He is in his 60s, lives on a lake, answers his phone on the second ring at any hour, and has never once told me what I wanted to hear. I told him about the hangar. I told him I would be standing at a podium in front of that same sergeant in less than 18 hours, and that part of me, the 13-year-old part, wanted to watch his face when he understood. Hank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You want my advice, or you want me to agree with you? Because those are different calls, and I only do the first one." I said I wanted the advice. "Command's not the day they salute you, Vesper," he said. He has called me by my call sign for 2 decades. Any idiot can enjoy the salute. Command is the year after the salute, when nobody's clapping and the work is boring and somebody has to hold the standard at 2 in the morning. If you spend your first morning making one sergeant the story, you'll have taught 200 Marines that this command is about you. It isn't. It's about the airplanes and the kids who fly and fix them. Don't make a 25-year-old the most important thing that happens in your first hour. He isn't worth your command. I did not say anything for a while. Out the window, the base lights made a low orange line against the dark, and somewhere out there was a hangar, and somewhere near it was a sergeant who had no idea he had spent his Sunday afternoon insulting his next commanding officer. "He broke the rule," I finally said. "Not the woman thing. My dad's rule, nobody's bigger than the airplane. He decided who got to stand near it based on a sundress." "Then you've already got your answer," Hank said. "You don't punish a man for being rude. You teach a Marine he forgot the rule. Those are different jobs, and only one of them is worthy of a commanding officer. Figure out which one you're doing before you walk in that room, because you won't have time to decide once the sergeant major calls attention on deck." I thanked him, I sat with it. And somewhere in that long, quiet hour, the decision finished forming. I was not going to humiliate Sergeant Brandt. I was not going to call him out, name him, single him out, or so much as look at him a half-second longer than I looked at anyone else. The room's own discipline would do more to him than any words of mine could. And whatever needed to be said to him, I would say later, in private, as a leader, not as a woman collecting on a debt. I want to be clear about why, because it would have been so easy and so satisfying to do it the other way. I did not choose restraint because I am a better person than you. I chose it because I have been on the receiving end of public humiliation, and I know exactly what it builds. It builds shame, and shame does not build Marines. It builds men who hide their mistakes instead of fixing them, which on a flight line gets people killed. I did not want Sergeant Brandt ashamed. I wanted him to understand. Those are not the same thing, and most people go their whole lives without learning the difference. I pressed the collar of my flight suit flat one more time. The oak leaves caught the lamplight. I thought about my father shaking my hand instead of hugging me the day I was commissioned and putting his hand on the back of my neck in the parking lot when he thought no one was looking. Then I turned off the lamp and I slept better than you would think. The next morning I put on the flight suit. I drove to the base in the gray light. And at 0700 hours, I stood in a small office behind the hangar deck and listened to a squadron I now owned forming up on the other side of the wall, and I waited for my turn to step off the high board. A change of command in the Marine Corps is a spare and serious thing. There is a formation, and there are colors, and there are a handful of words, and authority passes from one human being to another in front of witnesses, the way it has for a very long time. Colonel Teresa Hale, the group commander, my new boss, presided. The outgoing commander said his piece, and then it was my turn to accept the colors and to become, in the space of one sentence and one salute, the commanding officer of 200 Marines and a flight line full of airplanes. I will not pretend I do not remember the weight of that. I do. But I am not going to dwell on the ceremony because the ceremony is not the story. The story is what happened 20 minutes later when the formation broke and the squadron filed into the ready room for the first all-hands brief and the operational order for the deployment we were about to begin. The ready room is the heart of a squadron. It is where the flying gets briefed and debriefed, where the chairs are arranged in rows facing a podium and a screen, where the day's truth gets told. By tradition, the maintenance Marines, the plane captains and mechanics, stand along the back and the sides for the all-hands brief. They keep the jets alive. They have a right to hear the plan. I was in the small office behind the ready room when the sergeant major, a hard, fair man named Reuben Ellison, who had been running the enlisted side of that squadron longer than some of the lieutenants had been alive, put his head in and said, "They're set, ma'am." He looked at me for a second, the appraising look every good sergeant major gives a new commander, and then he nodded once, like I had passed some test I did not know I was taking, and went to do his part. I heard him fill his lungs on the other side of the door. Attention on deck! The sound of 200 Marines coming to their feet at once is a physical thing. It is a single great rush, chairs and boots and bodies, and then absolute silence. I have heard it many times. It never stops meaning something to me. I opened the door and walked to the podium. I want to describe this honestly, because the temptation in telling it is to make it a movie. It was not a movie. I walked to the podium the way I have walked to 100 podiums. I set down my notes. And in the second row from the back, along the wall with the other plane captains, was Sergeant Tyler Brandt, standing at attention with a paper cup of coffee halfway to his mouth, frozen exactly there, because he had just recognized the woman from the hangar. I watched the color go out of his face. It is a specific thing to watch. The blood leaving a young man's face as a very large piece of information arrives all at once. He understood, in that instant, that the lost wife he had shooed off his flight line in front of his Marines was the lieutenant colonel who now owned him, his job, his career, and his next 2 minutes. Here is the part I am proudest of, and it is such a small thing that I am not sure I can make you feel it. I let my eyes pass over him for exactly as long as they passed over everyone else. No longer. I looked at the back row the way a commander looks at her people on the first morning, taking them in, and my gaze touched Sergeant Brandt and moved on. The same speed, the same weight, as it touched the Marine beside him and the Marine beside that one. I did not let it catch. I did not let it linger. I did not give him the satisfaction or the relief of being singled out, even for a heartbeat. That was the whole punishment, and he felt every second of it, because there is nothing in the world more frightening than a powerful person who has every right to destroy you, choosing visibly, calmly, not to look. "Seats," I said. 200 Marines sat. Brant sat down very carefully, like the chair might be a trap, the cold coffee still in his hand, untouched, forgotten. "Good morning, Marines," I said. "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Quinn. As of about 20 minutes ago, I'm your commanding officer." And then I gave the brief. I am not going to walk you through all of it, because most of it is the ordinary, vital business of taking a squadron to war. The threat picture, the flying schedule, the standards I expect, and the ones I will not bend. But I will tell you about one part of it, because I built it on purpose, the night before, sitting on that motel bed. When I got to the part about how a squadron actually survives a deployment, I did not start with the pilots. I started with the flight line. "Some of you fly these jets," I said. "Most of you don't. Most of you keep them alive, and I want to be very clear with the aircrew in this room about something." I let it sit a second. "Every pilot in here is going to come home from this deployment because of the Marines standing along the back wall. Not because of how good we are in the cockpit. Because of how good they are on the line at 0300 in the rain, when no one is watching and there's no glory in it, and the only thing keeping a corner from getting cut is their own conscience. The plane captains decide who comes home. The mechanics decide who comes home. I have believed that my whole life, and I did not learn it in a school. I learned it from a man who turned wrenches on this kind of airplane for 22 years. I did not look at Brant when I said it. I made very sure of that, but I felt the back row hear it, and I felt one man in the back row hear it harder than anyone else, because the woman he had waved off a flight line was now telling 200 Marines that his job was the most sacred thing in the building. I closed the brief simply. "One last thing," I said, "and then we go to work. Some of you already met me this weekend, around the base, out of uniform. That's fine. I like to see a place before I run it." A few Marines smiled, not knowing. "But here's some free advice from your new CO. I am very easy to underestimate. I've been underestimated my whole career, and I have stopped minding, because it has become one of the most useful things about me. Just don't make it the most expensive habit you pick up on my flight line. Out there, deciding who belongs based on what they look like instead of what they can do is the kind of mistake that gets a jet broken or a Marine hurt. Look twice, be right, dismiss to your sections." The room came to attention, and broke into the noise of 200 people with somewhere to be. I gathered my notes. I did not look toward the back wall, and Sergeant Tyler Brant walked out of that ready room carrying a cup of coffee he never drank into the longest week of his young life. For the next several days, I said nothing to him at all. That was deliberate, and it was, I am told, far worse for him than anything I could have said. Sergeant Major Ellison came to see me on the second day. He sat in the chair across from my desk, the way sergeants major do, taking up exactly as much room as they intend to, and he said, "Permission to ask the CO a question that's none of my business." "Granted," I said. "There's a young plane captain walking around my flight line like a man waiting to be hanged," he said. "Brant, word's gotten around about the hangar on Sunday. The kids talk." He watched me. "He's expecting you to bury him. Office hours, working parties, the whole catalog. Far as I can tell, you haven't said his name once." "I haven't," I said. "You going to?" I thought about how to answer that, because the sergeant major is the keeper of the enlisted Marine's sense of justice, and if I got this wrong with him, I got it wrong with all of them. "Sergeant Major," I said, "if I haul that kid in here in day 2 and grind him into the deck for embarrassing me, what does every Marine in this squadron learn?" He almost smiled. He is too disciplined to fully smile in a CO's office on the second day. "They learn the CO's got a thin skin and a long memory," he said. "They learn to never make a mistake in front of her, which means they learn to hide their mistakes." "On a flight line," I said. "On a flight line," he agreed, and something in his posture changed, settled, the way a man settles when he has decided he can work for someone. "He didn't ask for your name, did he? Sunday. He just decided. He just decided." "That's the part that ought to cost him," Ellison said, standing. "Not your feelings, ma'am, the deciding. There's a difference, and most officers never find it." He put his cover under his arm. "I'll let you pick the time, but you should know the not knowing is doing more to that kid than office hours ever would. He's retorqued every fastener in his shop twice. The not knowing is the punishment. Question is whether you're going to leave it there or turn it into something useful. He left. I sat with that. The not knowing is the punishment. He was right. And leaving a young Marine in a state of pure dread is not leadership. It is just a slower kind of cruelty. The dread had done its work. Now I had to decide what to build on the cleared ground, so I started watching him. Not as groveling his work, I would walk the line in the mornings, the way I always have, and I would watch Sergeant Brandt without letting him see me do it. And what I saw surprised me. He was good. He was genuinely, unusually good at his job. He could spot a hydraulic weep from 40 feet. He moved around an airplane with the unconscious economy of someone who belongs there. He caught things the more senior Marines missed. The cocky tilt of his head that had annoyed me on Sunday turned out to be, on the line, the confidence of a young man who actually knew what he was doing. Good hands, I wrote in my notebook that week. Bad eyes. He could see a hydraulic leak from 40 feet and could not see a Marine standing right in front of him. That was the whole problem, and it was a fixable problem, which is the only kind worth a commanding officer's time. Then the workups gave me a gift, the way the work always does if you are patient. We were running the squadron hard to get ready to deploy, and one of the jets developed a recurring fault, an intermittent thing in a flight control computer that would not repeat on the ground, the kind of gremlin that makes a maintenance shop crazy. The pressure to get the jet up was real. We needed the sorties. Brandt was on it, and Brandt wanted badly to be the one who fixed it. I understood the want. He needed a win. He needed to be the good Marine again, instead of the punchline of the Hangar story. And under that pressure, he very nearly did the thing that good Marines do when they are desperate to look good. He nearly signed off the jet as fixed, based on a hopeful guess, a swapped component, and a clean ground check, without the data to actually prove the fault was gone. Staff Sergeant Pratt caught it. Pratt, who had frowned at the hangar door on Sunday, who had been quietly watching Brandt all week the way I had, stopped him with his pen, literally over the logbook. I was not there for it. I heard about it later, from Pratt, and then, much later, from Brandt himself. But I am told Pratt did not yell. He just asked Brandt one question. He asked, "You signing that because you fixed it, or because you want it fixed?" And Brandt stood there, with the pen over the book, and for the first time in a week, maybe for the first time in his career, he actually looked at the difference between those two things. Between doing the work and looking like you did the work. Between being right and wanting to be right. He put the pen down. He told Pratt he wasn't sure. They pulled the data, did it properly, and found the actual fault 2 days later, a chafed wire bundle that the hopeful fix would not have touched. The jet that hopeful guess would have launched was the jet a pilot would have been flying when the fault came back at altitude. I do not know for certain that anyone would have died. You never know for certain. That is the entire point of the standard. You hold it precisely because you cannot know which corner is the one that kills someone. My father taught me that, in his way. Standing under airplanes with his hands on his hips. Sergeant Brandt learned it that week with a pen in his hand over a logbook. And something changed in him after that. I watched it happen across the rest of the workups. He stopped working for the credit and started working for the work. He was the one who stayed late. He was the one who started taking the brand new Lance Corporals aside and teaching them flight line discipline. The real kind, the kind that is mostly about humility. I saw him do it. I did not let him see me see it. The hangar light in his shop burned past midnight more nights than not, and more often than not, it was Brandt under it, finally understanding the thing I had not yet said to his face. It was time to say it. I had him brought to my office near the end of the workup cycle, about a week before we deployed. I am told he walked over from the line like a man walking to his own execution. He had spent 3 weeks waiting for the axe. He was sure this was it. He came in and reported as ordered, ramrod straight, eyes locked on the wall behind me, the cup of coffee paralysis of that first morning still all over him. I let him stand there for a second. Then I told him to stand at ease, and he did, barely. I did not mention the word, honey. I want you to know that. I never once, then or since, repeated his words back to him. There is no leadership in rubbing a man's face in the worst thing he ever said. He remembered it fine without my help. Instead, I asked him a question. I asked, "Sergeant Brandt, what's your job?" He gave me the textbook answer. He said he was a plane captain, that he was responsible for the pre-flight and post-flight and the safe-for-flight condition of his assigned aircraft, that he launched and recovered and inspected. All correct, all true, all small. "That's what you do," I said. "I asked what your job is." He did not have an answer for that. Most people don't. "Your job," I said, "is to decide who comes home." I let that land. Every signature you put in the logbook is you deciding whether a pilot's kids have a parent next week. That's the job. The wrenches are just how you do it. He was very still. "I'm going to tell you something I don't tell many people," I said. "My father was a Marine, gunnery sergeant. He did your job. Power plants mostly, but he stood the same line you stand for 22 years. He's the reason I'm in this uniform. He raised me on a flight line." I looked at him. He had one rule. Nobody's bigger than the airplane. Not the pilot, not the wing commander, not the CO. And here's the part I want you to actually hear, Sergeant. In 22 years on the line, my father never once decided who belonged near his airplanes based on what they were wearing. He'd have torn a strip off any Marine who did. Because the airplane doesn't care what you're wearing. It only cares if you're good. I watched the words go in. I watched him understand, finally, that the woman in the sundress had been his commanding officer's whole inheritance walking back onto the flight line that raised her, and that he had stood in the door and told her she was in the wrong place. "You don't owe me an apology, Sergeant," I said. "You really don't. I've been called worse by better, and I walked off that line just fine. You owe the apology to the line itself, to the standard, to the idea that anybody who earns their way onto that flight line belongs on it, full stop, no matter what they look like to you." He said it anyway. He said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry, not because of who you turned out to be, because of how I decided who you were." Which was, I have to tell you, a better apology than most colonels could manage, and it told me everything I needed to know about whether he had actually learned it. I accepted it once. I told him it was closed, that I would not carry it, and neither should he, that a debt you keep collecting on is not justice, it is just a grudge with paperwork. And then I did the thing that I think mattered more than any of the words. I gave him a job. I made him the squadron's lead for flight line conduct and indoctrination for the junior Marines. The exact thing he had failed at on Sunday. I told him I was making him responsible for teaching every new arrival what it means to belong on the line and how you treat the people who walk onto it. I told him I was not giving it to him in spite of the hangar. I was giving it to him because of it. "You already learned the lesson the hard way," I said. "That makes you the right man to teach it the easy way. Don't waste it. Trust is not a feeling you announce. It is a weight you hand someone and then watch to see if they carry it." I handed him the weight. Then we shook hands, a lieutenant colonel and a sergeant, an entire rank structure apart, standing for about 10 seconds as two Marines on an oil-stained floor. And I sent him back to his line. We deployed a week later. And the hangar story, which had been the most important thing in the world to one young man for 3 weeks, became what it always should have been, which was nothing, a small thing that happened once, swallowed up by the enormous ordinary work of taking a squadron to sea. I am not going to give you a tidy bow yet, because deployments do not come with tidy bows. They come with long days and short nights and the slow, unglamorous business of being good at something difficult for months at a time. I led from the front because that is the only way I know how. I flew the hard sorties, I stood the long watches, I made the unpopular calls and ate the consequences of the wrong ones. Command, like Hank Brennan told me, is not the salute. It is the year after the salute, and the year after the salute is mostly boredom and fatigue, punctuated by moments that age you. I earned that squadron's trust the only way trust is ever actually earned, which is slowly, and by being the same person on the bad days as on the good ones. The hangar drama was ancient history to everyone but Brandt. And even for Brandt, it had turned into something else. He kept my words about the job, the real job, deciding who comes home, taped inside the lid of his toolbox. I did not know that until later. One of the other Marines told me. He had written it on a strip of tape in black marker and stuck it where he would see it every time he opened the box. Your job is to decide who comes home. I learned a lot about my Marines on that deployment, the way you only can when you are all far from home and tired in the same way at the same time. I learned that the loud ones are usually scared and the quiet ones are usually load-bearing. I learned which sections held the standard when the schedule got brutal and which ones needed a sergeant major standing over them. And I learned, watching Sergeant Brandt run his line, that the people most worth investing in are very often the ones who got something badly wrong once and were paying close enough attention to understand why. The Marines who have never failed at anything tend to be brittle in a way you cannot see until the night it matters. The ones who have failed and looked their failure square in the face and decided to become something better because of it. Those are the ones I want on the line at 0300 when a jet comes back hurt. Brandt had failed in a doorway, in front of his Marines, in front of a woman in a sundress. It turned out to be the most useful thing that ever happened to him, and to me, and eventually to a brand new Lance Corporal who will never know how he came to be taught so well. He was good. He got better. He ran his section of the line like a man who had finally understood what it was for, and he trained the young Marines exactly the way I had hoped, with humility instead of swagger, teaching them that everyone who earns the line belongs on it. The cocky tilt of his head was still there, but it had moved to where it belonged, to the airplanes, where confidence is a virtue, and off of people, where it is a vice. And then, about 2/3 of the way through the deployment, on a hard night, the work made its point the way it always eventually does. We were running a high-tempo, night operations, the kind of flying that stacks fatigue on top of fatigue. One of our jets came back with a serious problem, a real one, the kind that turns a routine recovery into a held breath. I am not going to spell out the details because some of it I am not at liberty to, and because the details are not the point. The point is that the airplane came back hurt, and a pilot's life and a very expensive machine both depended on how fast and how clean the maintenance Marines could turn it. Brandt's crew turned it, fast and clean and right, at an hour of the night when everything in your body wants to cut a corner just to get to your rack. They did not cut the corner. They held the standard in the dark when no one was watching, which is the only place the standard ever actually gets held. The jet flew again. The pilot came home that night and every night after. I watched the connection get made real, the connection I had described at that first brief between the Marines along the back wall and who comes home. I had said it as a principle on my first morning. That night, on a dark flight deck a long way from home, it stopped being a principle and became a fact, with names attached. Later that night, I stood alone on the deck, watching the last jets recover, counting them home the way commanders do. And I asked myself a question I had been carrying my whole life without ever quite saying it out loud. I asked myself whether I was finally done proving that I belonged. I had spent 30 years earning a place my father always swore was already mine. Every flight line, every briefing, every room where someone decided I was the spouse or the clerk or the lost woman in the sundress. I had answered the same way, by being undeniably good, by letting the work argue so I did not have to. I had built an entire life out of refusing to be told where I belonged by people who had not earned the right to say. And standing there in the dark, counting my Marines home, I did not have a clean answer to the question. But for the first time, I noticed that I had stopped asking it as often. The hangar in 1996 was very far away. My father had been gone for years. And somewhere in the long, ordinary work of command, of being responsible for who comes home, I had quietly started to believe the thing he told me on a drive home with the windows down, that the place was already mine, that it had always been mine, and that the only people who ever thought otherwise were people whose opinion he had taught me, correctly, not to spend my life arguing with. The jets came home, all of them. I counted them twice, the way I always do, and then I went below and slept the sleep of a person who has nothing left to prove and a great deal left to do. We came home in the early fall. I am going to tell you about the homecoming, and then I am going to let you go, because this is where the story finally gets to exhale. There is nothing in the world quite like a squadron coming home. The families gather on the apron in the particular light of an afternoon you have been imagining for months. There are signs and balloons and small children who do not entirely remember the parent walking toward them, and the long disciplined formation finally breaks and becomes 200 private reunions all at once. And a commanding officer's only job in that moment is to get out of the way and let it happen. I stood off to the side and watched my Marines come home, watched them find their people. It is the best feeling command ever gave me, better than any salute, better than any flying. I had taken 200 Marines to war, and I had brought 200 Marines home, and that arithmetic is the only kind that has ever truly mattered to me. I watched Sergeant Brandt find his family, and then I watched him do something that closed a circle I had been carrying since I was 13 years old. A few weeks after we got back, settled into the slow rhythm of a squadron in garrison, I walked the line one morning the way I always do. And I came around the tail of a jet and stopped because there was Sergeant Brandt, now Staff Sergeant Brandt, meritoriously promoted on deployment for exactly the kind of leadership I had handed him as a weight and watched him carry. He had a brand new Lance Corporal with him, a kid who looked about 12 the way they all do now. And Brandt was walking that young Marine onto the flight line for the first time. I stopped where they could not see me, and I listened. "First thing you need to understand," Brandt was telling the kid, "is that nobody out here is bigger than the airplane. Not you, not me, not the pilots, not the CO. The airplane doesn't care about your rank, and it doesn't care what you look like. It only cares if you're good." He pointed at the jet. "And the second thing, everybody who earns their way onto this line belongs on it. Everybody. You don't get to decide who belongs based on what they're wearing or what they look like to you. You'll be wrong, and out here being wrong about a person is how you get in the habit of being wrong about an airplane. Look twice. Be right. You understand me?" The Lance Corporal said he understood. He did not yet, the way I did not at 13, and Brandt did not at 25. But he would. That is how it gets passed down. That is how a flight line stays a flight line. I walked away before they saw me. I did not need them to see me. I had heard the only thing I came to hear, which was my father's rule, the one he gave me in a hangar in 1996, coming out of the mouth of the young man who had once stood in a doorway and told me I was in the wrong place. He had taken the hardest lesson of his life and turned it into the first lesson he gave a brand new Marine. You cannot ask for more than that from a person. You really cannot. That weekend, I drove out to see my mother, Lorraine, who is in her 70s now and still keeps my father's tools in the garage, oiled, in the chest he left, though no one has turned a wrench in years. We sat on her porch and I told her the whole story, the sundress and the hanger and the coffee cup and the toolbox lid. She laughed in the right places and got quiet in the right places. And when I got to the part about Brandt teaching the young Marine my father's rule, she reached over and put her hand on the back of my neck, the exact way my father did the day I was commissioned, and held it there for a second, and let go. "He'd have liked that one," she said. "He always said the test of a thing you teach isn't whether your kid learns it. It's whether your kid teaches it to a stranger." She looked out at the yard. "You taught a stranger your daddy's rule, Addie. That's him. 3 people deep now. That's about as close to forever as people get. I have thought about that a great deal since. So let me leave you with the thing I actually believe, after a lifetime of being told where I belong by people who had not earned the right to say it. When that sergeant told me 'wrong hanger, honey,' I had the power to ruin his afternoon, and within a day, the power to ruin a great deal more than that. Almost everyone expected me to use it. Part of me wanted to, and I want to be honest with you, because I think the honest version is more useful than the noble one. I did not hold back because I am a saint. I held back because I have learned that the cheap revenge and the real win are almost never the same move. And the cheap one feels incredible for about a day, and the real one feeds you for years. The cheap win would have been his face going white in front of his Marines and me walking out feeling 10 feet tall, and a young man learning to hide his mistakes from a CO with a long memory. The real win was a sergeant who became a staff sergeant who teaches strangers, now, that everybody who earns the line belongs on it. The real win was 200 Marines home. The real win was my father's rule, still loose in the world, doing its quiet work in people who will never know his name. If you have ever been underestimated, looked at and sorted and put in the wrong box by someone who never bothered to find out who you actually were, I want you to hear this from someone who has spent her whole life there. You do not owe those people your rage. You really don't. Your rage is too expensive to spend on people who could not see you. The best answer I ever gave to 'wrong hanger, honey' was not my rank, and it was not a single satisfying sentence at a podium. It was the year that came after, and the Marine that young man turned into, and a flight line where the rule still holds. That is the only kind of win I keep anymore. My name is Adriana Quinn. My father fixed airplanes for 22 years and taught me that nobody is bigger than the airplane, and that you respect the line or you stay off it. I flew the airplanes he fixed, and the proudest thing I ever did in that uniform was not earning the wings, or the cross, or the command. It was standing on a flight line in a sundress with every right in the world to flatten a man, and choosing instead to teach him. Thank you for being here with me. Walk the line, look twice, be right.